There exists a fifth dimension, not of senses, but of imagination, between light and shadow, between science and superstition, between fear and hope. It's a dimension of short stories that stay in our mind long after the end credits fade. Welcome to the Twilight Zone. There is something captivating about telling scary stories. Since childhood we search for a thrill, that moment when we feel that something is wrong, even though we can't yet say what. Some creators focus on building tension like Kubrick in The Shining, where every silence...
What are you doing down here?
is louder than a scream. Others, like John Carpenter in The Thing, shows that real horror isn't the monster, but the distrust between people. Hi, I'm Mr. Moss, and I love stories that, in a short amount of time, can evoke the exact emotion their creators aimed for. Unease, fear, sometimes sadness. That's why today we will trace together the history of short stories of horror and reflection. From the black and white television of the 50s, all the way to the internet legends of the 21st century. I especially want to focus on recommending to you a series called The Twilight Zone, which is a reason why series like Black Mirror or Love, Death and Robots exist in the first place. The journey won't be chronological, but rather based on how I discovered this genre and the ways in which I was scared throughout the years. So fasten your seatbelts and let's begin. Let's go back to the beginning of the 21st century. The internet back then was a bit like the Wild West, full of forums, anonymous users, and stories that spread faster than anyone could check whether they are real or not. It was exactly then that the phenomenon of creepypastas was born. The name comes from copypasta, text that you copy and paste on forums. Except in this case, it was not about jokes, it was about fear meant to evoke a feeling of unease in the reader, while maintaining an appearance of reality, all while telling entirely fictional stories. The first known creepypasta started appearing around 2007-2008 on forums such as 4chan, Something Awful or Reddit. The stories were often short, anonymous, and presented as authentic experiences. One of the most famous ones is, of course, Slender Man, tall, faceless, wearing a suit, appearing in old photos and in the forests. The character was created in 2009 by a user with the nickname Victor Surge. What began as a graphic joke very quickly turned into something bigger. Films, forums, fanfics were created, and even a crime. In 2014, in the state of Wisconsin, two 12-year-old girls attacked their friend, explaining they did it for Slender Man. The internet legend began to live its own life. It eventually led to the Slender Man game, which exploded in popularity on YouTube, and for a long time different creators were running through the forest, shitting their pants and collecting notes trying to survive an encounter with Slender Man, and he himself became forever written into the pages of pop culture. These are not masterpieces, but they work. Why? Because they're short, because they leave room for imagination. Because on the internet you never know what is real. I have two little stories that made an impression on me when I first read them, so I would like to share them with you. I was once sitting at the computer when I heard my mom's voice downstairs telling me to come for dinner. As I was walking down the hallway towards the stairs, a figure hiding in a closet grabbed my hand and my mother's voice said, "Don't go to kitchen." I heard it too. Wait, did any of you also see that text on the screen? Must have been my imagination. Creepypastas are modern urban legends told around a campfire, except this campfire is a computer screen. You send information into the world that for some might be just a silly story, and for others may evoke a real fear and panic. Whenever you create such a story, regardless of the medium, you must be aware of extreme reactions. One person will read it and move on with their life, and another won't sleep for several nights. And which one are you? Meanwhile, the internet didn't stop, and along with the development of technology, our fears changed too. We are no longer afraid of ghosts, we are afraid of notifications. Not the darkness outside the window, but the darkness in the screen. In 2011 in the United Kingdom, the series Black Mirror premiered, created by Charlie Brooker. Each episode is a separate story, often a short, closed form, showing how technology changes humans. And although it's not horror in the classic sense, the feelings it awakens can be more disturbing than any monster. The first episode, the national anthem, already showed that Brooker would have no mercy. The Prime Minister of the UK is forced by a kidnapper to perform an absurdly humiliating act in front of the entire country, live on television. It's not a ghost, not a demon, it's society which in the name of curiosity is willing to sacrifice a person. Another example close to us, gamers, is Playtest, where a guy wanting to make some extra cash agrees to participate in an experiment, which we follow from his perspective, except is his perspective really the true one? Are you able with 100% certainty say that what you see in front of your eyes is the real image of the world? Because, even scientists don't think so. And finally, Shut Up and Dance, an episode that is a perfect example of something known as subverting expectations, meaning building a story in such a way that at the climax it does something completely opposite to the viewer's expectations. Black Mirror is like a modern parable. Each episode is a warning against addiction to likes, to algorithms, and to ourselves. And although the first seasons were created more than a decade ago, today, in the age of artificial intelligence, deepfakes and digital identities, they sound more relevant than ever. Because maybe this is what the modern horror truly is. Not the monster lurking in the shadows, but something we hold in our pocket. Something that is listening right now and knows that you already know too. When Netflix released the first season of Love, Death and Robots in 2019, many viewers didn't know what to expect. Animation, sci-fi, horror. It turns out that it's a bit of everything, because each episode is a separate world, different style, different story and a different tone. Some are brutal and bloody, other melancholic and poetic. Sometimes they last 18 minutes and sometimes only 6, and each episode is meant to kindle slightly different emotions inside you. In most cases it works, unless you're watching the first episode of season 4, then I have no idea what that was supposed to mean, but I don't want to talk about bad episodes, I want to talk about my favorite ones. Therefore, I want to draw your attention to one of my favorite episodes of Love, Death and Robots, Beyond the Aquila Rift, where the crew of a ship discovers that the illusion of happiness might be worth more than the truth about loneliness in space. The creators masterfully guide us through this story, giving us clues about the ending. Clues that most people will notice only on their second viewing. Just look at this shot. Love, Death and Robots is a visual poetry, sometimes terrifying, sometimes moving. It's the spirit of the Twilight Zone in a 21st century version, in which every single story is a different genre, but the same goal, to make the viewer think even after the end credits. And this is where the secret of short form lies. In 6 minutes there is no room for boredom, for explaining everything. There is only emotion, and that emotion stays with us long after turning off the screen. But to truly understand where this form came from, we must go even further back, to the late 1950s. To the times of black and white televisions, when America lived in the shadow of the Cold War and everyone feared that the next day might bring atomic annihilation. In 1959, Rod Serling created the series The Twilight Zone, and he changed the history of television forever. Each episode was a separate short story, often with a surprising ending, a moral or social satire. Serling used fantasy and horror as a pretext to talk about human problems, racism, paranoia, war and loneliness. On one hand, I really want to tell you exactly what happens in the episodes, and on the other, it would be a shame to take away the pleasure of watching it yourselves. But here is my 2 favorite episodes, one will be without a spoiler and one with a spoiler. First one, the episode Time Enough at Last, about a man who is already exhausted by this world and all he wants to do is read, well, anything. But his boss at the bank demands that he will focus on his work, and his wife at home expects him to stop reading that nonsense. So poor Henry locks himself in the vault and finally has a moment to read in peace. But then... but that's not the end of the story, so I invite you to watch this episode. Second episode is Eye of the Beholder, this will be a spoiler, where a woman considered ugly undergoes surgery to look like the rest of society. That's nice. They do everything they can so that she will finally look normal, not hideous. And after many attempts and the final operation that could help her, it turns out that the society is deformed, with horrible pig-like heads, and she looks completely normal by our standards. Well, exactly, our standards. The Twilight Zone is not just a horror, it's a moral tale, a mirror in which a human is reflected. Sometimes this human is you. Rod Serling was a visionary, writing the script himself, often fighting censorship and using fantasy as a way to bypass political restrictions. At a time when you couldn't speak openly about the Vietnam War or racial prejudice, he hid it in science fiction metaphors. Without the Twilight Zone, there would be no Black Mirror. There would be no Love, Death and Robots, and even, in a sense, there would be no creepypastas. Because it was Serling who taught creators that the greatest fear doesn't lie in monsters, but in people. And with time you may think that these stories are weak or shallow, mainly because today we are overwhelmed by all sorts of pop culture and we know all these cliches by heart. But back then, it was something remarkable, something dark. From Twilight Zone through Love, Death and Robots to Black Mirror and internet legends, times, media and forms change, but one thing remains unchanged: our need to tell short, powerful stories. Stories that don't explain everything, but leave us with a question. Stories that in 10 minutes can say more about the human than a 3-hour film or 100 hours game. Because maybe that's where their strength lies, in what's left unsaid. You know, in that one moment of silence after the ending when you look at the screen and think, damn, that could really happen. Short forms of horror, science fiction and reflection are like dreams, intense, and when they end, something remains in you that you can't get out of your head. I often have dreams where I don't remember what happened in them, but that feeling that I felt in this dream stays with me for a long time. And that's exactly why we will keep returning to them, because Twilight Zone is not just a show from 70 years ago. It's stories about human nature and social commentaries, told much better than modern progressive works.
Actually, Tosh uses them for themselves now.
Thank you for telling me. That's why we recruited them.
So what's our next move, Rook? Arlithin, right?
I'm pulling a barf!
Some comfort comes from the fact that we entered these worlds only for a moment, but also there comes uncertainty, because we are almost entirely sure that something like that couldn't really happen. Well, almost entirely. So thanks for joining me on this journey through the history of short horror stories, and if you like this kind of vibe, leave a subscription, let me know which one of these stories made the biggest impression on you. Of course, if you are one of the 10% of people that last until the end of the video. I record about everything that I find interesting, and I really hope that I will find people who will share that interest with me, and maybe it will interest you too. If yes, then I'm pretty sure that I will see you in the next video, perhaps already on the other side of the mirror.